Hey everyone, it's Abby from The Wellness Dilemma, just jumping on here to set the stage for our part 2 episode of Understanding Intergenerational Trauma. Last week's episode, we introduced what intergenerational trauma is and what that can look like, some definitions around that, and some considerations when supporting someone who's had that experience. In part 2's episode today, we're going to be diving into some more examples, talking a little bit more about the ethics of supporting someone who's had that experience, and some of the evidence-based practices that are used to support someone in their healing from intergenerational trauma. So if you missed the part 1 of this episode, make sure you go and check that out before you dive into part 2. Okay, we hope you enjoyed this week's episode, part 2 of Understanding Intergenerational Trauma. One other kind of resource, there's a book, and I will admit I didn't finish reading it, not yet, but it's called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Woolen, and it's just what it sounds like. It didn't start with you. It's that idea that, maybe what I've been feeling, what I've been experiencing can be traced back to the generations before me.
Right.
Can be traced back to my ancestors and their experiences. And I know, so he's a psychotherapist. He kind of touches on how it gets passed down, what are those patterns. He encourages and promotes looking at it, being aware of it, which, again, is something that not everyone will have access to. So I'm not too sure how intersectional his approach is. Again, I haven't finished reading it, but I know that it's a really popular resource out there. It sounds like he takes a pretty holistic view, looking at kind of that genetic component, but also body memory, how it manifests in us, in our stress responses, in our patterns of behavior. So, that's another one, if anyone is interested in learning more, that's maybe worth a read.
Yeah.
So when thinking about how it ends up manifesting in us, how we embody it, there's so many signs, and I feel like it's pretty, again, subjective. Like, it's just
For sure.
so hard to say, this is it, this is what it looks like, because there's so many factors.
Yeah,
like,
for sure.
what do you think of when you think of like signs, or how to look for it in yourself?
So I think, I have language around it now. I probably always didn't have language around it. So I'm going to use the word trigger, which I know is a buzzword to some degree right now. But let's say not using the word trigger. So I think awareness of, for me, an actual physical manifestation. So, I could be doing anything in any place, and I will literally feel a physical sensation arising in my body, which then immediately just sort of puts my brain in a brain fog. And then from there, I usually am thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen next?
Instant fear and panic.
And for a long time, I'll just relate this back to the crazy. Like, I didn't understand what was happening to me. And I really, truly believed there was something wrong with me.
Yeah.
Until I got some help and I got some understanding, and I had my own process beginning with help from professionals and recognizing that body memory, even though I don't claim to understand even a small portion of it, I have experienced that, where there's a physical response to a situation where I am transported back to a trauma event, which I may not even be conscious of. And my body has a physical reaction to that, which can manifest out in, fear or, verbally speaking something to somebody, and it feels really irrational at the time.
Yeah.
Because you're thinking, okay, like, there's nothing wrong here. Like, nothing has happened, but you physically are transported back to a time or an event.
Yeah. But you're still trying to hold on to, like, the reality in front of you.
The reality in front of you. Yeah.
Because usually it is subconscious. Like, the experience and the legacy of trauma is usually happening subconsciously. So I think that's where the body and felt senses are so important to look at. And, like, I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, so it's okay if you don't want to answer this, but, like, could you describe that physical feeling? Like, what does it feel like happens for you?
Honestly, it depends on the circumstance.
Yeah.
But usually for me, it's kind of a mishmash of a combination of, like, fear and anger. I can feel it just rising up, and physically I get very hot. My face usually turns red. And then my brain just goes on overdrive, where I have a million thoughts that I cannot control, where I'm just making up stories about a certain thing, and I'm attaching meaning. And so it really is a physical and a neurological response.
Yeah. And it's a script.
It's yeah, there's definitely a script. And so a lot of times now, I feel that coming on. I will either exit, like I will just remove myself to try and diffuse that, or try and, like, be alone to...
Yeah, I was going to ask why you exit.
Yeah, usually it's to extract myself out of the situation that I feel is causing me to react this way. And so it gives me space, and it really, I guess what it is I'm protecting myself, right? Like, it's a response of either fight or flight.
Yeah.
So, and I tend to be a fighter, so I tend to go for the fight. But as I've recognized the signs more, I have been kind of just taking that pause or removing myself. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, like, when it comes to trauma and our stress response, we use whatever is available to us.
Yep.
And so if you're in a situation where, fight would maybe cost you your job, or cost you your relationship, or cost you your reputation, like, that's going to not feel like an option. So we look at other options. And that's just the process that our body runs through as a way to, like you said, try and protect us. And it just goes through that in a matter of seconds. I was asking you because I relate to that.
Okay.
I feel like I've been more of a fleer, but I hope my husband doesn't mind me sharing this story, but, like, there was a time in the early days of our relationship where I experienced a really big trigger out in a public place with lots of people around. We were there with friends, and it was just like, nope. Just this wall came up, And I think my go-to is kind of like dissociating a little bit. Like I step outside of myself, and then I'm like, nope, this is not. I gotta go, and I just left. Like I didn't even tell him, and I just was like, phew, I'm out of here. And again, like you said, it's that I've got to protect myself. I need to remove myself from what feels like the threat. And I think part of me also just like wanting to avoid what could happen if I stay.
Right.
But you're not thinking about it. Like it just happens. It's that default or that script that just pops up immediately. And yeah, sometimes you just wonder, like, you know, is all of this my script? Is some of this, you know, from before my time? You know, what has been so long standing? And obviously, you know, for women and, you know, the oppression and gender-based violence that we've experienced always, you know, that's a pretty old script beyond any of my ancestors that I've ever known. Right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think in relation to intergenerational trauma, I mean, I'll just use like a really simple example of growing up. What was modeled was, you know, when there was an upset or when somebody had an emotional break where, and what I mean by break is like break in their relationship, so miscommunication or somebody hurt someone or whatever. The response was to flee, basically, to shut down. So it was like become quiet, clean the house feverishly, like just, you know, drive yourself into something where you can flee the situation. And I saw that pattern, you know, develop in me as well. And it wasn't because, like, it was just literally modeled behavior that not even knowingly I picked up. So even in a situation where it's not like an acute trauma situation, there's still responses that historically we've taken on, and becoming more and more aware of, like, why am I responding this way? And is this really helping me? Is this hurting other people? It's just so interesting to me. And, you know, as we grow and as we interact with other people, we learn more about ourselves, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I totally relate to, like, the something is wrong, I must do the dishes immediately. Like, that is also my go-to, and I like, and it's such an innocent, simple, and I think probably relatable to so many people who've been socialized as women or wives, or you know, your go-to is to just clean or be in the kitchen, and it gives you this sense of, like, I have control of something. But it's totally innocent and usually isn't going to be something that's, like, super harmful. But yeah, it's kind of funny to think about.
You know, I just want to go back to what we were just talking about these responses to past trauma or even present trauma. And I think it's really important to recognize that these are responses, legitimate responses of fear, you know, and protection. Because, I mean, when we were talking about the definition of trauma, you know, an experience that you interpret as, I am not safe, harm is coming my way, I need to protect myself. And I just find it so interesting that in any situation, we don't know what or when could make us feel that way. And you're not crazy. You are literally just responding to a situation that makes you feel unsafe, unprotected, fearful, and that you are trying to avert being hurt again.
Yeah.
And this is a normal response. And obviously it can be very disruptive, and we don't want to stay there, but we need to recognize why it's happening.
Yeah, be able to understand it and look at it with empathy, look at it with softness, not harshness and judgment of ourselves. And that is the trickiest dance. It's the hardest thing to do, but such an important step and part of why we need other people to support us to get there, because usually if we're left to our own minds, we'll just like beat the shit out of ourselves in our own head. Like, we can't be left alone with ourselves.
Yeah.
But just like you were saying there too around triggers, when we experience something traumatic, it is a perceived threat.
That's right.
So that doesn't mean, like, someone else could look at that situation and be like, you know, maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a partner, a teacher, a coworker. You know, why are you being so sensitive? Why are you being so whiny? There's no real threat. That's not. Why would you think that's going to happen? That's your. You know, it's in your head.
Yeah.
And there's all these ways that we continue to perpetuate that harmful narrative.
Yeah.
And point the blame, but it's a perceived threat.
That's
your body perceives. Usually, it's subconscious. Your body is feeling threatened, and when we are under a threat or when we do experience trauma, it pulls from all of our senses. And so triggers do the same thing, that a trigger can be anything from our senses. It could be a smell, a sound, a visual cue. It's not necessarily, I feel like I'm going to die right now, or I feel like I'm going to be physically injured.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important to recognize as well, and, you know, not point the blame just because we don't see it. It's about the person's experience. It's about the person's perceived reality of that situation.
And I think that's why it's so important to have people or find people or you know, ask for help or referrals to people who can support you and understand this, because, you know, I have experienced times where, you know, I am going through something or responding to something, and unfortunately maybe somebody who's around me does not understand. It is not their fault. They don't have the tools, or they haven't just been educated to understand what is happening. And I think it's important to find someone who does understand and who you can build a relationship with and trust, someone who you can reach out to or call or say, you know, this is happening or this happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just the importance of that trauma-informed lens.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that intergenerational trauma shows up and manifests in us. I think we've touched on some of them already, but, you know, shame is a whole topic in itself.
Yeah.
So I think we'll probably end up doing another episode on that as well. You know, anxiety, depression, some mental health disorders, you know, there has been like a proven link to genetic expression. It's not as simple as like A plus B equals C, that there's like a direct causal link, but it can exist and have that expression.
Body memory or brain fog. I know there's like times where there's chunks of experience that is just missing.
Yeah.
So dissociating or blocking out memories. Yeah.
Yeah, that is definitely one that I can relate to. Like, I have experienced a lot of gaps in my memory around times that were like pretty significant in my life.
Yeah.
And not just from early childhood, but just feeling like, I know I've always said, well, not always, recently, as we've been talking really openly about this, I know I've shared with you that, like, you know, I've had these like thoughts or feelings or emotions come up around certain situations where it's like I don't understand why I feel that way because I can't link it to a specific memory of mine.
Right.
So for me, that's the closest to body memory that I can really relate to, is like something is coming up in me. I feel a sense of like unease or caution around this, but I'm not 100% sure why or where that comes from.
Yep.
And it's so hard to look at that and say like, oh yeah, it's because of this. But
For sure.
I do think it's worth considering, and you know, again, that's really up to the individual's perception of, you feel what you feel, and you know, you might not have a way to explain that to someone else or for someone to be able to make sense of it, but it still exists and lives within you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that can also happen like physically, where a certain touch on your shoulder or something can make you jump or react in a certain way, and that may be linked to a specific thing or it may not be.
Yeah. Pretty much like any kind of unexplained, like you have this strong reaction or you have these emotions, or maybe even around anxiety.
Yeah.
Patterns like seasonal depression patterns. You know, these can be things that your environment really creates those conditions or can contribute to your experience and how it develops in you.
For sure.
It's just so vast, honestly, and someone's experience is just so unique that we could never say, like, intergenerational trauma is this or it looks like this.
That's right.
And also, like, we have our own scope, we have our own lens, there's limits to our experience, whereas other communities will have different interpretations of that just based on their own belief system and their own cultural norms, right?
That's right.
Yeah, it's so interesting and so complex. I think that's something that's really beautiful as well that we see in other communities, the art of storytelling. Yeah, it is just very broad, and we could never summarize everything or list every experience. It's just so personal and so unique. Yeah, it's really fascinating how it actually manifests.
Yeah.
Even like as we've been talking and trying to record this, I'm pretty sure you would agree that this somatic release is like bubbling up in me, like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's a heavy topic, and then, you know, you're having your own responses to discussing it. So we've had a few laughing meltdowns.
It is like a weird thing, though. It's like when you hit something on the head,
Yeah.
or you know, something that has been bubbling up behind the scenes or repressed, or right, where like once you touch on it or address it openly out loud, it can be like this weird release of like, whoa, it's out there now.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, interesting, and maybe I'm jumping ahead and just say if I am, but
No.
you know, there's been studies done, and this was something that was touched on in my trauma conscious yoga training about, you know, if you take a rabbit who's either being hunted or hunting or going to, well, I guess rabbits don't really hunt, but
they hunt grass.
they hunt dandelion
they
leaves.
hunt stalks of grass, and yeah.
But let's say a rabbit is being hunted, and it's completely frozen, like it freezes, right? And then at the right point when it's going to flee, it'll run off, and then if you observe them, they shake and they shiver, and they've done studies on this where it's literally an automatic response in the animal world where they are shaking off that, because that would be a traumatic experience. I mean, if you're being hunted,
it's life or death.
It's life or death.
Your life, yeah.
And so similarly with like our own whatever comes up for us, laughing can be a response to, releasing and channeling, whatever's feeling stressful for you or wanting to be let go.
Yeah.
It's just such an interesting concept.
Yeah, it's so vast. And again, like we were saying earlier, trauma is felt in the body. It's usually very, like, intense emotions are very physical experiences for you.
Yeah.
If you can think about the last time you felt angry or panicked or stressed about something, what your heart was doing, what your hands were doing, what you felt happening in your body, if you even noticed it, like
your body temperature.
Yeah. Like we feel it in our bodies, and like what you touched on there, essentially polyvagal theory.
Yeah, that's right.
And we'll do a whole episode or multiple on that, but that's exactly it. Your body has all these reactions and interactions, and it's kind of cool, but sometimes inconvenient, but it's cool. Like it's really interesting, and it's like it's all part of the process, right?
For sure.
So I mean, just as the experience of trauma is so unique, the experience of healing is also very unique. And there's no right or wrong. There's no one size fits all. Often I feel like it's a lot of trial and error, and that can be really exhausting. That can be a really stressful process. Also, we need different things at different times. So, something that might have worked for you in the earlier stages of healing won't work for you now. Maybe you need something differently.
That's right,
because you're in a different place, or you've, like some therapies and some approaches focus on the mind and kind of that top-down approach. So like cognitive behavioral therapy being the one that comes to everybody's mind first, really focused on your thoughts and how your thinking creates the reality, creates the experience, or feeds into what it feels like. And just like anything else, it is a tool. It can be a really helpful tool. It doesn't necessarily give us a holistic approach.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily cover every aspect, like mind, body, spirit, all the elements of us that are impacted by trauma and intergenerational trauma, especially when thinking of Indigenous communities, marginalized groups who, being told, like, you just have to be positive, like, just change your mindset. Again, you can't, like, shift your mindset out to get you out of oppression. Like, it's kind of dismissive to be told, like, just think positively, just change your thinking, and then the situation will change. And I know that CBT is not that simple, but
of course.
Sometimes that is the message that's sent.
It can be, yeah.
And, we want to be careful to really look beyond the individual level and make sure that we're not ignoring what's happening on a community, familial, or systems level. really focusing on, cultural aspects. If family therapy is appropriate, bringing your family to be part of your healing. Having the context to understand the historical impacts and also the ongoing impacts of racism, discrimination, oppression, understanding things like internalized oppression, internalized racism. There's just so much nuance and so much to really understand, and just making sure that you're making space for those experiences rather than putting all of the emphasis and all of the responsibility on the individual level. That's just not setting anyone up for success or healing.
And I think just exactly being able to recognize that this is a complex issue, especially when you're dealing with systemic trauma, oppression. Your average TikToker or Instagrammer that's like 5 steps to heal from trauma.
Yeah.
That is just not going to cut it. I mean, we need to be vigilant to recognize that this is not a simple thing.
Yeah. We can't oversimplify it.
Yeah.
Or make, all these broad, generalized statements and act like they might apply to all people in the audience, because that's just not the case. And that's why it's so important to, do your research, interview someone before you work with them.
Yeah.
If it is a therapist or some type of wellness practitioner, take the time to get to know them. Like, that's such an important process to see if they're going to have the context and the understanding of what your experience might be.
Yeah, for sure.
So, CBT is one approach. Again, it's top down, and, it is an evidence-based approach. There are trauma-informed versions of cognitive behavioral therapy. So if you are looking for that, if you feel like it's easier for you to be in your head than it is in your body, that might be a place to start. But again, have a conversation. Don't be afraid to ask those questions, and just know that there are other options out there if one feels like it doesn't fit for you. It's all about just finding what works for you. And then if we're looking at more of that bottom-up approach, focusing on our body, what's happening in our body, looking at more of a holistic approach, something that includes a somatic lens, somatic experiencing, focusing on those physical sensations, how we mirror each other. Like, that's probably part of what is happening when we're laughing, and
for sure,
all those funny feelings are coming up. And I think all of that work is relationship based. Like, how comfortable you feel with the person is just going to have such a big impact on, I don't know, I guess what you're able to uncover, how safe and how comfortable it feels.
How safe you feel to be vulnerable with that person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Family systems therapy. So looking at, I honestly don't know that much about family systems therapy. I know it's kind of a foundation, looking at kind of the dynamics that happen, and I guess taking a broader approach than just looking at the individual. And, there's also, I think it's a relatively new approach, internal family systems. So looking at different parts of us that maybe have different scripts or different narratives, different lenses, that maybe have developed through our experience of intergenerational trauma.
For sure.
EMDR, so this is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and I've never experienced that.
No, me neither.
So I've never gone through it, but I've heard really positive things about it. If you find someone who has that training, it's pretty thorough training, and essentially it's going through a memory or an experience and kind of reprocessing and reframing that in the context of safety and support, and building capacity and tolerance for that. Again, I'm probably butchering it, and that's like super simplified, but just touching on some of the evidence-based approaches. Narrative therapy, what else? Mindfulness. There's a lot of really good evidence around mindfulness, and you know, you are probably used to hearing this through yoga and stuff. I know I'm someone who has really struggled with mindfulness and like being present in my body, being present with my thoughts.
Absolutely, because it can be a trigger. A lot of things in some of these, like I'll speak to yoga. Breathing techniques, for example, can be a trigger for people, and this is why it's so important to come from our work from a lens of trauma consciousness.
Yeah. And can you, so trauma-informed is what we typically hear, and then there's the trauma-conscious framework. What's the difference, or is there a difference?
There isn't a real, that for me personally, that can be interchangeable. Trauma-informed is probably what I would most like to use. But yeah, I mean,
I think trauma-informed is what people recognize.
People do recognize, yeah. You know, I think trauma conscious, when I use that term, really specifically relating to, let's say, the yoga practice or a workshop, or because it reminds myself to, even though I am trauma informed, which comes from a place of education, being trauma conscious is a continual thing, that you are acting in a conscious way for possible trauma triggers. So that would be really the difference in explanation for me.
I've also heard people talk about like how you can be trauma informed, like you're informed about it, you know some things about it, but it doesn't mean that you're bringing it to your conscious and you're practicing it or utilizing it and continuing that awareness of it. So I like using the term trauma conscious because it is kind of a signifier that like I think sometimes when you see trauma informed, it's a bit of a buzzword now, something that unfortunately, not always, but sometimes people just slap that on as like a stamp of, hey, we've got that checkbox.
Exactly.
Where it's not actually being practiced. And I think what you said is so important, and we touched on it earlier in the episode, that we're constantly learning more about trauma. And if you are someone who's going to be trauma conscious or trauma informed, that needs to be an ongoing practice, and it never stops. You're always learning, you're always increasing your awareness and your understanding, and for me that's part of being trauma conscious, is just that commitment to learning more.
Exactly. And you know, that happens in multiple ways, right? Like experientially, it could be an interaction or an exchange that you have between you and another person, or it could be a course that you take or a book you read, or, you know, it's just that bringing that conscious awareness means being open to hearing from people who are experiencing a trauma response, and you might not relate to it, but that's what's true for them.
Yeah, I think being open to listening, giving people platforms, giving people compensation as well, like that is such an important piece. And also, when we talk about being ethical, we also want to make sure we're not learning on the backs of survivors or on the backs of those with lived experience of oppression. Making sure that we're not just like asking someone, well, can you explain it to me? And having another, it's like another act of taking and enslaving and I don't know, that's the only way I can think to really explain it, or that's the way that I've come to understand it so far.
Like a survivor retelling their story over and over, sort of almost with the possibility of being re-traumatized for the sake of educating somebody else.
Yeah.
Where in actual fact, if you want to become trauma informed and trauma conscious, take the initiative to find the legitimate resources that can educate you.
Yeah, there's so much out there for us to educate ourselves, and like even being settlers, like white settlers, we can access, our own education to understand and have more empathy. And it doesn't mean that we're going to understand every experience. We could never.
No.
But to make the effort to not put the burden on that individual, where it's like, do this service for me, you owe me. Like, it's just, I think it goes back into this power dynamic, which is the opposite of being ethical and the opposite of being trauma informed, where we're understanding that knowledge is an exchange, and we can learn from each other. We should learn from each other, not sitting up here as like this authority who has all the answers. But yeah, you're exactly right about, re-traumatizing someone, being aware of the impact it could have to ask someone to share their story or to share details.
I mean, these, I'm just going to read out, these are the sort of the guideline, the 4 R's, you can say.
The 4 R's,
of being trauma conscious. So realize the broad impact and recovery process. Recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. Respond by creating and integrating practices and policies that will support trauma survivors. And resist re-traumatization. So just being mindful of those things when you are interacting with people on a daily basis, or in your profession, or in your workplace, or in a, supportive role. I think it's important to keep those things in the forefront of your mind.
Yeah, it's all about like increasing that awareness, consideration of others, consideration of experiences and perspectives outside of our own. Knowing that, my experience is just one, but there are many. And even like, I can't remember if we've said this before, but even, recognizing that we're both survivors of violence, within survivors, everybody has a unique perspective and experience. So, just really getting comfortable holding a lot of nuance, thinking really critically, looking at what are all the pieces of the puzzle, how are things interacting with each other and intersecting with each other. And for us, like being in a support role, being super transparent about, our approaches, our perspectives, being honest and upfront,
Yeah.
being clear, making sure that if someone is going to be making decisions about their own healing, as they should, they're able to be informed about what that process means, what it looks like, what its limits are.
Yeah.
There's so much to consider, and knowing your own scope, knowing your own limits, and having resources where if I can't do that or that's beyond my scope, there's a resource that I can offer that it does meet that scope.
That's right.
Not leaving people hanging where, they're activated and then left with nothing. And that's something that I think happens when people are hired to be public speakers, for example.
Right.
To share their lived experience. That story is shared for the benefit of the audience and whatever the subject is. But that could be a really re-traumatizing experience for that individual. And if they're not supported, if that process isn't clearly explained to them, then maybe they're under pressure. Oh, this isn't what I thought it was going to be like.
Yep.
Oh, I didn't realize, I'd be recorded, or, oh, I didn't realize
Absolutely.
I'd have to, whatever. And it's just, we just have so much to really consider when we're supporting people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that for me, I think about why we started this podcast in the first place. And, we were talking earlier about the importance of psychoeducation, how we've been able to use that in our own healing, and just seeing the benefit of having access to research and information. And I think that, for both of us, psychoeducation is such a big part of healing.
Absolutely, yeah.
We just cannot underestimate the importance of having access to that and those kinds of resources. Again, it's such a broad topic. We could never cover everything, and I'm sure after this I'm going to watch back and be like, oh, there were 12 things I wish I said and I didn't, but maybe we'll do a follow-up episode.
And reach out to us if you have any questions or a topic that you want us to discuss.
You can post in the YouTube comments or the Spotify. There's a little Dropbox. It'd be awesome to hear from people what they thought or what we missed or what you want to hear next. But hopefully this has just given you a foundation to go off of and just start the conversation. I'm glad that we got to talk about this, and I know it's been a long time brewing, so we'll probably touch on it again, but
thanks for watching, guys.
I think that's all for now. We'll see you on the next episode of The Wellness Dilemma.